Okay, I want you to imagine two friends, Alex and Ben. So a year ago, they decide, they're going to learn the guitar together. They buy the exact same model. They download the same app for learning, and they make this pact. 1 hour every single day practice. And for the first few weeks, honestly, it was pretty much a tie. They're both struggling, right? Same clumsy chords. They're celebrating learning the same simple songs, putting in the exact same time. Okay, fast forward to today, a year later. The difference, it's staggering. Alex is now like fluidly playing complex pieces. He's improvising solos. He's even started writing his own music. He's called him a musician, right? Ben's guitar, well, it mostly just sits in a dusty corner. And when he does pick it up, he's still sort of fumbling through the same 3 chords he learned way back in the first month. He's frustrated, he's bored, and honestly, he's probably about to quit. Now get this, they both logged the same 365 hours. So what happened? Why did the exact same amount of time produce such wildly different results? The answer, I think, exposes one of the biggest myths about learning any skill, a myth that might actually be holding you back right now. So today, we're going to move beyond just, brute force logging time. Because the difference between Alex and Ben, it wasn't really the duration. It was the sophistication of their effort, right? The question we really have to tackle is, if just putting in time doesn't guarantee mastery, well, what does? And the answer seems to lie in this concept called deliberate practice. We're going to be diving deep into the research today, looking at everything from cognitive science to surgical training manuals to really understand the path to expertise.
That's absolutely right. Our mission today is really to unpack the real science behind how people get good at stuff, expertise acquisition. Right. Because for too long, popular culture has kind of lashed onto this simple, very catchy idea, the 10,000-hour rule, as if, reaching mastery is just about hitting some milestone on a stopwatch. We're here to clarify that the sheer number of hours, it's secondary. What truly matters is the quality of the structured effort you put in during those hours. We're looking at how you practice, not just how much. We need to establish this foundation that, look, the volume of hours is pretty much meaningless if those hours are just spent reinforcing existing habits, which are often, frankly, faulty.
Okay, let's unpack this thing, deliberate practice. Because the myth of the 10,000 hours, it really exploded, didn't it?
Yeah.
Largely thanks to Malcolm Gladwell citing the work of Anders Ericsson, the foundational researcher here. Ericsson studied these elite violin students, right? But the interpretation just got, distorted. It turned into this sort of prescriptive magic number.
Exactly. It wasn't meant to be a magic number. It was just a description of an average outcome he observed in a very specific, highly dedicated group.
Right.
Precisely. Ericsson and his colleagues, they proposed this deliberate practice view of expert performance, and it was a huge shift, really, a paradigm shift away from that old kind of fatalistic idea that experts are just purely born with innate talent. But the public discussion that followed, it completely oversimplified the key mechanism. So we need to go back to the source and define deliberate practice DP precisely. We need to distinguish it sharply from, say, Ben's aimless guitar strumming we talked about earlier. Deliberate practice, fundamentally, it's a highly structured activity. It's not casual. Its explicit, singular goal is always the improvement of performance. See, if you're just practicing to maintain a skill, well, that's just maintenance practice. It's not deliberate. DP demands sustained hard work, full attention, intense concentration, and critically, it takes learners constantly beyond their current comfort zone. It has to be effortful. You're pushing your limits, not just coasting within them.
Okay, so if I'm, say, learning a language, just watching movies with subtitles, that might be time spent with the language, but it's not DP unless I'm actively drilling like complex grammar structures that I always mess up.
Exactly.
Or maybe practicing conversation in a context I find really hard, like ordering food in a super noisy restaurant.
That is the perfect distinction. Yes.
Yep.
To meet the definition of deliberate practice, specific tasks have to be invented maybe by a coach, a mentor, or even the learner themselves, and those tasks must specifically target identified weaknesses. You're focusing on weaknesses, not just playing to your strengths, you see. And this whole process requires that your performance is carefully monitored. You need immediate, reliable cues or feedback for improvement. That rigorous, objective feedback loop is absolutely non-negotiable. Alex, with his guitar coach, he was doing this. Ben wasn't.
That makes the whole 10,000-hour rule look incredibly flimsy then, because those, let's say, 10,000 hours Ben put in just fumbling the same 3 chords are qualitatively completely different from Alex's 10,000 hours spent doing focused technique drills and getting constant feedback from his coach.
Absolutely. That 10,000-hour number, it was derived from an average amount of practice logged by the most accomplished group of elite violinists at a German academy by the time they were 20. It was an observation of a highly dedicated group, not some universal threshold or a magical requirement for success. There's nothing magical about 10,000 hours. Researchers have shown since then that the average hours linked with expert performance vary significantly by domain, and maybe more importantly, they vary wildly among individuals within the same domain.
Right, and we see that huge variability even in things like games, right? Which you'd think would be pretty easy to standardize competitive activities like that.
Oh, definitely. Take master-level chess players, for example. Studies have shown just enormous variability in the accumulated deliberate practice hours they needed to reach that master level. Some logged at just a bit over 3,000 hours. Others needed over 23,000 hours.
Wow.
That's not a small difference. That's a massive range in the rate of acquiring expertise. If 10,000 was some kind of rule, that spread would be impossible. It tells you the clock isn't the main thing.
Okay, so this brings us back to that core debate. Talent versus practice. If the idea isn't to rely on some scarce innate ability, what are the sort of fundamental principles researchers generally agree on now?
Well, researchers have definitely moved towards a consensus that kind of refutes those old notions of just, fully formed innate talent. The first principle is pretty clear. All skills require practice and support to develop. Nobody's born knowing how to play the violin or code software. However, and this is crucial, we also have to acknowledge that deliberate practice doesn't explain all the variation we see in elite performance.
So DP is necessary, but maybe not sufficient on its own.
That's the consensus, yes. Other traits are critical, and here's a key point. Individual differences, things like your background or maybe your general cognitive ability, they don't necessarily constrain the ultimate level of performance someone can reach. However, they definitely seem to influence the rate of expertise acquisition, how fast you get there. And that rate is what we need to dig into next. Why some people seem to need only 3,000 hours while others need 20,000.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Why does the rate of learning vary so much? If two people start at the same point and they both dedicate themselves to structured DP, what accounts for that massive speed difference?
Well, the first accelerator that research points to is something called cognitive efficiency. Your general cognitive ability, it's a significant individual difference that influences how efficiently you process information during practice. And that speeds up the rate of acquisition. What's really fascinating here is a finding from studies across the arts, sciences, even leadership. They found that those individuals with the greatest lifetime productivity, the highest levels of eminence, they often required the least amount of time to acquire the necessary expertise. They learned faster, essentially because they were more cognitively efficient.
So it's kind of like optimizing the brain's resources, using less mental energy for the same high-level result. They aren't just processing information, they're processing it.
Yeah.
Smarter, I guess.
Precisely. Smarter, more efficiently. Brain imaging studies actually support this idea. People who perform well on tests of general cognitive ability often use fewer neural resources to solve new and complex problems. They're just more efficient at detecting patterns and using fluid reasoning. And a great concept that illustrates how this connects to practice is chunking. You've probably heard of it. Chunking is that strategic process of grouping related bits of information into single, meaningful units. It lessens the cognitive load. Think about memory champions, right? They don't memorize 100 individual numbers. They might memorize 25 four-digit chunks that look like dates or times and maybe forming a familiar story or pattern in their heads.
Right, okay, I can visualize that. Like in music, a beginner sees a sheet of music as, 100 separate notes. But an expert sees that same passage as maybe 4 or 5 distinct phrases or musical patterns, each one a single chunk.
Exactly. That's a perfect analogy. Researchers found that effective strategy use, like chunking, consistently activates the prefrontal parietal brain network. Now, this is the very same network that's heavily involved in working memory and general cognitive ability. This network is what allows for the conscious detection of patterns, and that's really the cornerstone of efficient learning.
And you can see this correlation in formal tests, too. You mentioned the Raven's progressive matrices test. For people who aren't familiar, what exactly is that test, and why does it seem to correlate so strongly with learning efficiency?
Sure. The Raven's test, it's a nonverbal assessment. You're shown a sequence of geometric shapes, usually in a grid, and you have to figure out the missing piece that completes the pattern. You have to infer the underlying rules and relationships. It measures what's called fluid reasoning, your ability to solve novel problems independent of knowledge you've already acquired. High scores on the Ravens tend to correlate strongly with superior cognitive ability because they show an individual's knack for recognizing complex relationships quickly. And those who can do this efficiently, those who can sort of chunk complex incoming information on the fly, they have a distinct advantage because they often require fewer repetitions to internalize the underlying principle. Less cognitive load.
Okay, so cognitive efficiency, that's one powerful accelerator. But you mentioned a second factor, equally critical, motivation. Because all the efficiency in the world is useless if you quit after 100 hours of what is, by definition, grueling, deliberate practice. DP is hard work.
Absolutely. Sustaining the motivation to engage in that hard work and deliberate practice over long periods, that's vital. Researchers acknowledge that, yes, heritable individual differences might influence how much you initially enjoy an activity, and critically, your capacity to engage in that hard work. This long-term persistence is so important that even strong proponents of general cognitive ability have concluded that some kind of motivational factor, something that sustains enormous and prolonged interest, likely plays a larger part in achieving extremely exceptional performance than general cognitive ability itself.
That deep, durable, long-term drive. I think the research highlighted an often overlooked characteristic that fuels that drive. Inspiration. But hang on, is inspiration something we can actually measure, or is it just sort of a soft psychological concept we use to explain why some people stick with it? How do researchers quantify a clear vision or inspiration in a study?
That's a fair question. And no, we aren't just talking about some fleeting feeling here. We're talking about a powerful factor that sustains motivation over the long haul. When people become genuinely inspired, they're usually propelled by a very clear future image of themselves, a vision they want to realize. Researchers can actually quantify this by measuring the individual's belief that this vision is attainable. It's that belief, that conviction, that seems to transform a person from apathy to sustained, goal-directed engagement. It helps them navigate the inevitable obstacles over the long term.
And what's really fascinating is the idea that inspiration doesn't just increase effort. It might actually boost that first accelerator we talked about, cognitive efficiency.
That's the really intriguing link, yes. Studies have shown that inspiration measured both as a personality trait and as a temporary state doesn't just increase creative productivity, but also the efficiency of cognitive tasks. For example, in studies looking at writing, inspired individuals, they had a larger number of typed words actually retained in the final product, and they spent less time pausing or editing mid-thought. It suggests a smoother, more efficient cognitive flow. It's like the purpose unlocks the brain's optimal performance.
Okay, let's bring in a story here that seems to capture this synergy, perfectly raw, aptitude, structured effort, internal purpose. It's about a violinist, let's call her Sarah. She had the classic gift, perfect pitch, natural dexterity, sailed through her early training, easily clocked her 10,000 hours, won every competition in sight.
Right, so she had the aptitude, the cognitive efficiency was likely there, and she had the structure. Should have been unstoppable, you'd think. But she still hit a wall, which happens surprisingly often when the underlying motivation is, well, maybe a bit weak or purely external.
Exactly. She gets to a top conservatory, and her playing is technically flawless.
Right.
Machine perfect. She could execute any piece with absolute precision. But audiences and judges all agreed it was cold, empty, hollow. Her motivation, it turned out, had always been purely external. Winning the next competition, achieving that technical flawlessness. She was performing a highly optimized routine, perhaps, rather than creating art.
And the pivot she needed required her to kind of ditch the definition of practice she'd always known. She noticed a classmate, someone who struggled more technically, often played with this devastating emotion. Why? Because his motivation was purely internal, this desperate, burning need to make the music truly come alive.
So her coach recognized this deficit and gave her a really counterintuitive assignment. He actually prohibited her from practicing for performance for a whole month. Instead, she had to spend an hour every day just listening to a single piece of music, not analyzing the notes, but really feeling the emotional arc. Then she spent another hour just improvising, playing whatever came to her with absolutely no goal or judgment.
That intentional shift, moving from extrinsic goal setting, like winning, to intrinsic purpose, like emotional expression, that was the deliberate practice she needed for her next stage of mastery. She was essentially reconnecting the technical machinery, which was built by all her rigorous practice, with her own genuine motivation, her own reasons for loving music in the first place.
And the transformation that followed is just the ultimate illustration that mastery isn't just about the clock or raw talent. It's about that synergy. You need the raw aptitude, guided by targeted, structured, effort, deliberate practice. But it all has to be fueled by a deep, personal, unshakable purpose. She mastered the technical skills so they could finally become a conduit for genuine emotion, rather than being the goal in themselves. Okay, so we've established that for individual pursuits like music or games, DP is powerful, but maybe not the whole story. Now let's shift the discussion into these high-stakes professional fields where repeatable, structured expertise isn't just nice to have, it's an absolute necessity. Think medicine or psychotherapy. This is where education has really been intentionally engineered around DP principles, hasn't it?
Absolutely. K. Anders Ericsson's work, it's profoundly shifted medical education away from those frankly dated traditional apprenticeship models, where residents learn mainly by passive observation or worse, trial and error on actual patients. The shift is towards rigorous evidence-based training. It's sometimes called education engineering. And the whole aim is to design, develop, and calibrate these really rigorous curricula using deliberate practice principles from the ground up.
So what does that engineered training actually look like in practice? If a medical school is designing a curriculum based on DP, what are the absolute must-have features?
Well, researchers have distilled Ericsson's principles into what they call a practical DP bundle in medical education. It consists of about 10 integrated components for acquiring clinical skills. It starts with needing highly motivated learners, obviously, people able to maintain concentration, and it requires engagement with a very well-defined learning objective or task set at just the right level of difficulty. Not too easy, not too hard. This leads into focused, deliberate practice designed specifically to challenge the learner. But the truly engineered parts are the mechanisms for assessment and improvement. The training requires rigorous, precise, and reliable measurements that yield actionable feedback from educational sources, like simulators or expert observers. Importantly, this feedback needs to be immediate and non-judgmental. Trainees also have to monitor their own learning, correct their strategies, engage in more DP, and keep going with assessment until they reach a really rigorous mastery standard.
That emphasis on a fixed outcome, everyone reaches this high standard, regardless of the time it takes, that leads us straight into this model built on DP, known as mastery learning, ML.
Exactly. Mastery learning is essentially a hybrid model built right on that DP foundation, and its goal is to guarantee competence. The core premise is that learning time can vary, but outcomes must be uniform. The goal is excellence for all, basically. In mastery learning, students practice, often using simulation and getting that feedback, until they reach a high minimum passing standard, or MPS. This standardized approach is designed specifically to overcome the presumed influence of innate attributes. If a student is highly efficient cognitively, they might pass quickly. If another student struggles, they're given targeted practice, maybe more time, until they also hit that same fixed high standard.
And the evidence here seems overwhelmingly in favor of this structured approach compared to the old ways, right? Because traditionally, if you struggled with a procedure, you just kind of hope you got better on the next actual patient.
Right, and that old model is really seen as inadequate now, ethically problematic even. The empirical evidence comparing simulation-based medical education, SBME, that uses DP, versus traditional clinical education just learning via patient care, it showed dramatic results. A major meta-analysis pooling data across 14 different studies showed that SBME combined with deliberate practice was superior to traditional clinical education, without exception, and with very high statistical confidence for skill acquisition.
But hold on, I have to ask, isn't there a risk that simulation, it lacks the real stakes, the nuance of actual patient interaction? What did the researchers find about the transferability of skills learned in that DP simulation environment versus those learned by just doing it on the job?
That's a really critical question, the transferability to the real world. And the superiority shown in those studies wasn't just confined to the simulation lab. It extended to the transferability of skills to the actual operating room or the clinical environment. Because the practice in the SBME setting is so highly structured, so precisely measured, and tied to objective clinical markers, not just subjective judgments, the skills seem to become deeply ingrained and resilient. They're learning robust processes, not just rote procedures.
Okay. To make this really tangible, let's look at the example of a surgeon. Let's call her Elena. Her story perfectly illustrates that difference between just brute force hours and targeted DP.
Right, Elena. She was a young surgical resident, brilliant on paper, theoretically knowledgeable, had steady hands, but she was really struggling with a complex laparoscopic procedure. Her performance had just plateaued. Why? Because her approach was simply to log hundreds and hundreds of hours in the simulation lab. She basically believed the 10,000-hour myth. Just practice more.
She was stuck in what we might call naive practice, just repetition without purpose.
Exactly. Her senior surgeon was getting frustrated too. But then a visiting expert came in and changed the game entirely. He didn't tell her to practice more, he told her to practice differently. The key shift was implementing that rigorous, detailed feedback loop we keep talking about. Perform, record, analyze, drill. They'd review video footage of her simulations frame by frame. They'd pinpoint the exact microtremor in her hand or the precise moment her instrument angle faltered, maybe the difference between a 3-degree angle and a 5-degree angle, and then she would focus only on correcting that one specific micro weakness in short, intense, maybe 30-minute bursts.
That's the absolute definition of inventing specific tasks to overcome identified weaknesses. It shifts the effort from practice the whole hour-long procedure to fix that tiny 3-degree tremor for 10 minutes.
Precisely. And the result? Within just 2 weeks, that awkwardness was gone. Her procedure time dropped dramatically. Her expertise was unlocked not by the sheer volume of hours, but by that focused, targeted feedback loop that turned raw time into true resilient skill. And in high-stakes fields like surgery, the shift isn't just about efficiency. You could argue it's a moral imperative to ensure every training hour maximizes its impact on future patient care.
And DP isn't just limited to physical procedures like surgery. It's now being heavily used in really complex interpersonal fields too, like psychotherapeutic skills development, where the skill involves things like empathy and managing complex emotional responses.
That's another critical domain, absolutely, because therapeutic effectiveness directly, measurably impacts patient outcomes. DP is being applied here to develop these essential micro skills, things like building a strong therapeutic alliance, responding empathically, even repairing ruptures in that alliance when they inevitably happen. These are all factors proven to have a significant impact on treatment success. And you can't just, read a book about empathy and suddenly become empathic in a session. It takes practice. A key part of psychotherapeutic DP is often called the behavioral rehearsal BR phase, usually anchored in group supervision models. This involves doing short role plays based on isolated patient statements, often taken directly from video recordings of actual therapy sessions. The therapist improvises a response, then gets immediate peer and supervisor feedback. They assess the difficulty, adjust their approach, and repeat. It allows therapists, particularly those perhaps trained in a more prescriptive medical model, to learn how to shift to a more collaborative psychotherapeutic stance.
We have a really clear illustration of this with the case of Tao, a psychiatrist who was learning to shift his approach. He sounds like a smart guy. Maybe his default setting was efficiency, fixing problems, which sometimes clashes with the emotional needs of therapy.
Right. Tao was part of a group supervision, learning something called affect phobia therapy. His initial tendency, pretty typical for his medical training background, was to solve problems quickly, tell the patient what to do. Crucially, he felt uncomfortable with strong emotions. He had often changed the subject when the patient got distressed. So the overarching goal of his DP was to help him become more able to tolerate those strong feelings himself and to collaborate more effectively with his patient, let's call her Pia.
So instead of just discussing theory, the supervision group would actually do behavioral rehearsal. Repeatedly role-playing scenarios where Tao felt that impulse to jump in and fix things or maybe avoid a difficult feeling. What would a supervisor actually say in that moment?
They would halt the role play right there, and the feedback would be hyper-specific, something like, Tao, notice you paused for less than half a second there before changing the subject. Let's try that statement again, but this time, consciously tolerate the silence for a full 5 seconds and respond only with an empathic reflection, maybe acknowledging the anxiety you heard, but without offering any solution. The BR was highly structured, focusing intensely on specific skills like empathic reflection or taking what they call a not knowing stance.
Wow, that forces the learner to build almost a new muscle memory for handling those really tough moments.
Precisely. And Tao, he diligently practiced these skills even outside of the supervision group. He'd review his own recorded therapy sessions, rehearse different responses until he found ones that felt both natural and therapeutically effective. He realized that the structured, targeted repetition was absolutely key to developing competence that actually transferred into the real-world sessions with Pia.
And the result was objectively measurable, wasn't it? It wasn't just that Tao felt like he was getting better.
Absolutely. That's critical. Over the course of therapy, the patient, Pia, showed significant, measurable progress. Her scores on the outcome rating scale improved dramatically, moving her from within the clinical population range well into the non-clinical range. And the core change was attributed to creating new relational patterns in therapy, where she could learn to tolerate mixed feelings and repair alliance rupture skills, modeled and facilitated by Tao, skills he acquired through his focused, deliberate practice.
And these same principles, it turns out, apply just as powerfully in the corporate world, right? Where speed and resilience are everything, especially in rapidly changing tech sectors. Let's look at that software example from Tokyo.
Yes, the modern knowledge economy also desperately needs systems that cultivate expertise deliberately. The story we heard was about a senior software engineer in Tokyo. His company, trying to master some new technology, defaulted to that classic hustle culture. 14-hour workdays, brute force reading of manuals, trial and error coding. What happened? It only led to burnout and stagnation, mainly because they were just repeating old mistakes, maybe a bit faster, but not actually learning effectively.
Right, they were just getting older, not necessarily better. A key difference between just time on task and real DP.
Exactly. Their rival company, meanwhile, which was successfully innovating, had implemented a strict corporate mandate for structured learning. This shows how corporate L&D strategies can actually integrate DP. They stopped mandatory coding work at 6 p.m. sharp. But the last 2 hours of the day were dedicated purely to DP. This involves structured exercises, things like code kata, simple programming exercises repeated to perfection to build fluency in new languages or algorithms, and also structured pair programming focused specifically on difficult functions.
And the key seems to be that immediate mandatory review aspect, right? Which forces that rigorous, precise feedback loop we talked about earlier. It wasn't just coding, it was analyzing the process of coding itself.
That constant structured feedback loop, yes. It created deep, resilient expertise in their engineers. The result: lower error rates, higher innovation. Meanwhile, the rival company, just demanding long hours, was braining out its talent. It really highlights that in a sector that changes maybe every 18 months, the ability to deliberately and rapidly build new skills is the ultimate competitive advantage. And often it requires fewer total hours than just unstructured brute force effort.
Okay, we've laid out a really compelling, well-researched case for deliberate practice being this essential key ingredient for expertise, pushing us way past the simple 10,000-hour myth. But we absolutely have to address the complexity here. If DP is so crucial, why does logging hours, even structured DP hours, still lead to such huge performance variability? Like we saw with those chess masters needing anywhere from 3,000 to over 23,000 hours.
This is where we really need to bring in the critical findings from a major meta-analysis done in 2014. It directly challenged the strong claim, often associated with Ericsson, that individual differences in performance are largely accounted for by DP. The data from this large-scale analysis show that, yes, DP explains a moderate chunk of the variance in certain fields, but a frankly, shockingly small amount in others.
Let's look at the numbers, because they are quite dramatic, aren't they? And they really force a critical reevaluation of the whole theory scope.
They really do. So in highly specific, often self-contained domains, DP performs reasonably well. It explained about 26% of the variance in performance for games like chess, about 21% for music, and about 18% for sports. Now, that still leaves roughly 75% or more of the performance unexplained, but clearly DP is a major factor in those areas. However, when we look at professional careers and general education, the role of documented deliberate practice hours seems to shrink almost to nothing. In education, think course grades. Standardized test scores DP accounted for only about 4% of the performance variance. And critically, in the category they called professions, this included things like computer programming, military aircraft piloting, management, consulting. DP accounted for less than 1% of the performance variance.
Less than 1%. Wow. That's a massive finding. It really forces us to ask, if DP accounts for less than 1% of success in these complex professional careers, what on earth is accounting for the other 99+%? Why did the metrics used, like log practice hours, fail so spectacularly to capture the true drivers of success in these high-level roles?
It forces us to make a crucial distinction between two types of problems, what some call tamed problems versus wicked problems. Tamed problems are those that are predictable, relatively static, and have clear rules, like playing a specific piece of music perfectly or perfecting a single jump shot in basketball. DP is excellent for taming those kinds of problems. Professional success, however, is often defined by navigating wicked problems. These are problems where the targets are constantly shifting, the environment is unpredictable, the rules aren't clear or they change, and success demands adaptability, managing ambiguity, making high-stakes decisions under uncertainty. Success in sales, for instance, might rely heavily on political savvy and networking. Success in management relies on adaptability, leadership, judgment. These are factors that are incredibly hard to measure simply by logging hours spent practicing management skills.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so my ability to perfect a single surgical stitch like Elena did, that's a tame problem, solvable with focused DP. But my ability to manage a team through a totally unexpected corporate merger, that's a wicked problem. And the number of hours I spent practicing my budgeting skills last year has almost zero predictive power over my success in that chaotic situation.
Precisely. And that brings us directly to the first major moderator of the DP performance relationship identified by that meta-analysis: task predictability. DP has a much, much larger effect on performance in activities that are highly predictable. Activities where the environment is stable, the required actions are highly constrained. Think running a 100-meter dash on a track or practicing a piano concerto in a quiet room. For these high predictability activities, DP explains around 23 to 24% of the variance. But for low predictability activities, situations where the environment changes rapidly while the performer is acting, like handling an unforeseen aviation emergency, diagnosing a rare disease with ambiguous symptoms, or even refereeing a fast-paced soccer game, the variance explained by DP drops dramatically, down to somewhere between only 4% and 14%.
Right. So DP is fantastic for optimizing a routine that rarely changes, but it's much less effective, or at least less of the whole story, when the real challenge is handling the totally unexpected or navigating the constantly shifting terrain of a complex professional career.
That appears to be a fundamental limitation, yes. The second moderator they identified relates to how the practice itself is measured. Studies that relied on retrospective estimates, basically asking experts to recall how much they practiced years or decades ago, tended to find a stronger effect for DP. Probably because, let's be honest, we all tend to overestimate how much hard work we put in looking back, especially if we were successful. But studies using the gold standard log method, where practice is actually recorded on an ongoing, daily or weekly basis, found that DP explained only about 5% of the performance variance overall, across all domains studied. This strongly suggests that those retrospective estimates might be significantly inflating the perceived importance of past practice hours.
Okay, so if DP, even structured practice, only accounts for a relatively small percentage in professions and these low predictability tasks, what other factors are explaining the vast amount of remaining variance? What else is in this cocktail of expertise, especially for those wicked problems?
Well, several well-established factors come back into play, influencing both the rate of learning and the ultimate level of performance, particularly in these complex domains. The most obvious one is general intelligence and specific abilities. These consistently predict performance in diverse domains like music, chess, and certainly academics. While they might not set an absolute insurmountable ceiling for performance, they absolutely influence that rate of acquisition we talked about earlier. More efficient learners get there faster. A specific cognitive ability that researchers have really highlighted is working memory capacity. You can think of this as the RAM, the random access memory of your brain. It's your capacity to hold a set of information actively in your focus of attention while simultaneously processing new, complex incoming data. Studies have shown that working memory capacity positively predicts performance, for example, in piano sight reading skill, above and beyond the amount of deliberate practice someone has accumulated.
And why does that matter so much, that working memory capacity?
Well, because if you have a higher working memory capacity, you can simply hold more complex patterns, rules, and variables in your mind simultaneously. This allows you to reason more fluidly through new problems without mentally dropping crucial pieces of information. Importantly, working memory capacity was found to be equally important for beginners and for seasoned experts. This suggests it's a pretty fundamental ingredient, sort of the cognitive horsepower required to process complex information efficiently, regardless of how skilled you already are.
And finally, there's that tricky issue of starting age. If I decide to start learning the guitar at age 40, like Ben perhaps, no amount of DP is necessarily going to allow me to compete head-to-head with the 25-year-old virtuoso who started rigorous structured practice at age 7.
Starting age is complex, yes. Erickson initially argued that the advantage of an early start was simply that it gave you more time to accumulate DP hours. However, subsequent research, particularly in domains like chess, showed that starting age negatively predicted the ultimate performance level achieved, even after controlling for the total accumulated DP. This suggests there might indeed be optimal developmental periods, perhaps tied to key phases of neural development in childhood and adolescence, for acquiring certain complex cognitive skills, and that advantage might not be fully overcome later in life simply through sheer effort or hours logged.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive has really shown us that the difference between Alex and Ben, the struggling beginner and the emerging musician, it wasn't merely effort, was it? It was the sophistication of their approach, absolutely, but also potentially fueled by their underlying cognitive efficiency and, crucially, a durable intrinsic drive. It really wasn't just about the clock, it was about the design of their entire learning system.
Ultimately, yes. The path to world-class performance, especially in complex, unpredictable fields, requires understanding that expertise is the synergistic cocktail. It absolutely needs structured, targeted practice. Deliberate practice is essential. But that practice must be optimized by cognitive efficiency, and it needs to be driven by a deep well of motivation, maybe even inspiration, especially when navigating those wicked professional landscapes. Mastery seems to be less about the clock, less about hitting 10,000 hours, and much, much more about optimizing the learning process itself, choosing direction over sheer duration. The focus perhaps should always be on refining your own system of improvement, because maybe the most valuable outcome isn't just acquiring a specific skill, but developing the capacity to constantly and efficiently learn throughout your entire life.